we're about to have a conversation that I've been looking forward to having for a long time now. It has to do with the topic that I'm certainly not an expert on, but lucky for us, we have an expert joining us to talk about nuclear energy. Joining us now to talk about some of the myths surrounding nuclear power is John Kotek. John Kotek is the Senior Vice President of the Nuclear Energy Institute. John, thank you so much for joining us.
Anna, thanks for having me.
So let me just start off by saying, I kind of bought into a lot of the myths and fear mongering about nuclear energy up until someone challenged me on it, to be quite frank, not personally, but I was listening to a news broadcast about the topic. And then that made me want to investigate a little further. And then I learned about Germany decommissioning its very last nuclear plant and transitioning to the dirtiest form of energy, which is coal. And I was pulling my hair out of my head because the climate emergency is very much real, and switching over from nuclear energy, which is considered a clean energy source, to coal sounds like a bad idea. Do you think it's a bad idea? And if not, why?
Yeah, it is a bad idea. And I mean, certainly keeping nuclear power plants operating on the grid is the simplest way and the most cost-effective way of holding carbon emissions down. And that's why we've been so happy to see first state governments here in the US and then more recently Congress take action to provide financial backstops to ensure that we don't shut down any more nuclear power plants. And they've also been taking very strong steps to help get some new ones built.
Yeah, you're right about that. In California, the governor, Gavin Newsom, was planning on shutting down a nuclear power plant, and he actually backed out of it, which I thought was a good thing to do. But let's talk a little bit about the myths surrounding nuclear energy, because let me start off by asking you to steel man the argument from your opponents. What do they say about the dangers of nuclear power?
Well, I mean, certainly you'll hear folks bring up concerns about nuclear safety. They'll talk about radioactive waste, and you'll hear questions raised about the nuclear proliferation and the cost of nuclear power. And and all of those things, of course, have good answers to them. Don't know which ones you want to take on first. But what I will say is kind of a big picture statement is the challenges associated with nuclear are same thing you have with any other energy supply. You look at any source of energy in isolation and you can find a lot of things to not like about it. But when you look across the board on the full life cycle impacts of nuclear versus other sources of energy supply, you see that nuclear has a whole lot to add, particularly as you're looking to transition to a lower carbon energy system. And so if you want a system that's reliable and affordable while getting to lower carbon, you want something that is what we call firm clean, like nuclear, that can run around the clock and is there when you need it. Nuclear also has the advantage of creating a whole lot of very high paying long-term jobs in communities where they're most needed. And so that's a big part of the reason why you've seen such strong bipartisan support for nuclear power, both in the states and at the federal level in recent years.
Pausing here to deliver some honest truth as we do in our news coverage as well. TYT is facing challenges, guys, as the entire industry is. You know who could make the difference? You. If you hit the join button below, it's gonna make all the difference and keep us in business. We appreciate you, thank you.
So I want to tackle all of the concerns about nuclear energy one by one in just a moment. But before we do, I think it's important to talk about where we are in regard to the development of renewable energy, right? Wind, solar, because I think that there's been, for a long time, this thought that wind and solar renewables could essentially completely substitute the fossil fuels that we've relied on, but that doesn't seem to be true, at least not so far.
Yeah, no, that's right. And as my old boss, Ernie Moniz, who was Secretary of Energy when I ran the nuclear energy part of the DOE during the Obama administration, as he would say, it doesn't violate the laws of physics to decarbonize the grid going 100% renewables, but it's going to cost you a whole lot more, right? It's going to be a whole lot harder. The reason is, of course, renewables are distributed, and so you have to go to where the sun or the wind are best. And those, particularly with wind, those tend to be remote locations where you've got to transmit power over great distances to where the load centers are, right, on the coast. And that's really expensive. And as somebody who has worked to site both nuclear power plants and long distance transmission lines in my career, I can tell you long distance transmission is harder. Right? Because you're talking about linear projects with a lot of impacts. We've seen a lot of pipeline proposal opposition in recent years. Well, transmission lines, unfortunately, engender the same sorts of opposition. And so what happens with a system with 100% renewables is you need a lot of long distance transmission and you need a lot of storage. And you have to overbuild those things because you don't build the grid to serve power supply in an average day. You build a grid that can serve power supply when conditions are worst, right? Because we rely so much on energy. As a result, it just costs you multiple times more than if you include a healthy share of nuclear power in your system.
So, there are so many different factors at play here that concern me because on one hand, of course, the climate emergency needs to be responded to substantially. It is a real emergency. At the same time, and I don't know how audience members are gonna feel about me confessing to this, I don't really want to change my lifestyle and I don't want to take on the financial burdens associated with transitioning to other technologies. And so far, in the state of California, even though you'll hear, no, they're making sure that working people aren't impacted by some of these transitions, they absolutely are, financially speaking. You know what I'm saying? So with nuclear, you keep mentioning the affordability. Can you get a little more specific or elaborate on what you mean by that?
Yeah, you bet. So when you are talking about adding some of this intermittent generation like solar or wind onto the system, that when you add a small amount of it, it's really good because you're not able to pay for fuel, right? You're getting sun or you're getting wind. And so you can have very low production costs. The problem is the more and more of that you add onto your system, right, the less and less useful it becomes because when it's, when you're getting solar power, you're getting it all at once. You're not getting it when people go home at night, for example, when you really need it when electricity demand goes up. And so when you bring that nuclear power into the mix, for example, like they're doing in California by keeping their nuclear power plant online, you wind up having to overbuild less of that solar and less of the storage that you would need to otherwise make your system reliable using just renewables. So what you're going to find, to your point about paying more, let's face it, new generation is going to cost more than continuing to run a coal plant that you've been running for 40 years, right? Just the way it is. But we need to make this transition to a cleaner energy system. What we found over the years is that when you do things like California has done and like the federal government has done to provide strong incentives for things like wind and solar, you can help those technologies come down the cost curve. And so while solar, for example, was quite expensive 15 years ago, solar production costs have dropped by like 10 times over the last 15 years. Now we need to do the same thing for these firm, clean technologies like nuclear to ensure that they can also move down that cost curve and provide even more and more reliable and affordable generation as we get further and further down this decarbonization curve that we're pursuing.
So you mentioned new technologies, which is a perfect transition to some of the concerns that people have had in regard to nuclear. So let's start off with the biggest concerns, the biggest argument that you'll hear from people. They'll usually reference the disaster that transpired in Chernobyl, or they'll reference a more recent, accident, the Fukushima nuclear power plant that, of course, was threatening due to an earthquake and subsequent tsunami that happened in March of 2011. So what is your response to people who are concerned about that?
Yeah, so what you see in the new designs that are coming to the market now, and some of these have already been built. In fact, the two new reactors in the state of Georgia incorporate a lot of learnings like I'm about to describe. We've been running nuclear power plants for more than 60 years in the US. You learn a lot over that period of time. And one of the things that's been learned in that time is you can have even safer nuclear power if you move away from active systems, things like pumps and valves, and you rely more on natural phenomena like gravity or natural heat convection. And so what you'll find is a lot of these new designs incorporate what we call passive approaches to ensuring safety, so that you don't wind up in a situation like Fukushima, where frankly the reactor survived the earthquake and the tsunami just fine. The problem was they lost their connection to the electric grid and all their backup power supplies got wiped out, right? But if you had these passive systems available in a situation like that, you wouldn't run into that same challenge. So these next generation technologies that are coming to market now are even better than the frankly very safe technologies that we've been running for decades.
Have the newer nuclear power plants been implemented anywhere in the world yet?
Yep. So the two in Georgia, so Vogtle 3 and 4, which Unit 4 just came online. There are multiples of those that have been built or are being built overseas. There are other technologies that are being implemented now. So, for example, a company that Bill Gates founded called TerraPower is building an advanced reactor that happens to be cooled with liquid metal in the state of Wyoming. That's a very passively safe design, as is a gas-cooled reactor that a company called X-Energy is building alongside Dow in Texas to provide both power and heat to help decarbonize production at a chemical facility. And that's an important part of the decarbonization challenge that's often overlooked. We tend to think about the grid, which of course is important, but it's also in many ways the easiest part of the decarbonization challenge. When you start looking at decarbonizing heavy industry or long distance transportation, oftentimes you can't do that with renewables, and there's a particularly valuable role for nuclear to play in those sorts of challenges.
And one of the other concerns, of course, has to do with the waste that's produced at nuclear power plants. How do you dispose of that waste? It's polluting and harmful to the environment. What is your response to that?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked about that. In fact, I was responsible for the federal program to address nuclear waste when I was in the Obama administration. And the good thing about what we call spent nuclear fuel is that there's a very small amount of it, and it's straightforward to manage. So nuclear fuel stays in a nuclear reactor for about 5 years producing power. And when you take it out, it's both physically and radioactively hot. And so you'll first cool it in a pool for a couple of years, and then you'll move it into something called a dry storage container. And those have been proven, shown by our Nuclear Regulatory Commission, to be safe for more than 100 years of on-site storage. And we know where it all is, right? It's unlike carbon emissions or other air pollution emissions that go up a stack and other forms of electricity generation. With the nuclear power plant, you know where the spent fuel is. It's easy to manage on site at the nuclear power plants. Over the lifetime of a nuclear power plant that might run 60 or even 80 years, the amount of spent fuel that you store and you put into what we call dry storage casks for long-term storage, they'll fit on a concrete pad about the size of a hockey rink, right? So you're generating clean electricity for hundreds of thousands or even millions of people for decades, using a facility that can store all of its waste in a footprint that's that small. So when you do the math and you compare nuclear and the challenges of nuclear with the challenges of other energy technologies, nuclear starts to look really good, and that's why you're seeing so much interest, not just here, but overseas in building new.
Yeah, I mean, I think oftentimes you have to do a cost-benefit analysis with new technologies, and when it comes to energy, a good example is the EV batteries, and you have to get rid of those batteries, and there's been some arguments about how polluting those EV batteries are. But I think all of this stuff is so fascinating. The final question I'll ask you is more about geopolitics, because when you look at a country like Iran, the United States and its allies, the US allies, would argue that they were enriching their uranium. Iran argued that they were doing so for nuclear power in their country, and so does enriched uranium have to be utilized for these nuclear power plants, or are there other methods to do this?
Yeah, so certainly in the types of reactors we use here in the US, that fuel is enriched, but it's enriched to nowhere near the level that is used in a nuclear weapon. So the uranium that's enriched here in the U.S. is enriched to a level of about 5% of the isotope uranium-235. When you dig uranium out of the ground, it's about 0.7% of that isotope. So you have to concentrate it, in effect. And so, yes, you'll always have a need for uranium enrichment for the types of facilities that we're talking about here, but they don't use weapons usable material. And in fact, that's something that all designers here in the US stay away from, is anything above the 20% cutoff that is generally viewed as getting into that weapons usable range.
That distinction's fascinating. Well, John, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about nuclear energy and the myths surrounding it. John Kotek, Senior Vice President of the Nuclear Energy Institute. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Adam.
Thanks for watching. If you become a member, you get to watch all this ad-free, except for, of course, this ad. Still, hit the join button below.